role with associated permissions. The primary topics up for discussion today are, first off, the color module, excuse me. It's a core Drupal module which can be leveraged in a handful of ways, depending on how creative one wants to get. But today we'll be discussing it as a way to change color site-wide in the theme layer and explore different integration techniques to use to solve potential institutional branding issues that might pop up across the site once it's been installed and configuration begins. Next up, we'll be talking about context, something we're probably all familiar with by now. The Drupal context contrib module is likely one we've all had a chance to work with. And given its usage in modern Islandora, it's really working behind the scenes to do a lot of what we're already experiencing. Context allows you to manage contextual conditions and reactions for different portions of your site. So straight from the Drupal.org page, you can think of each context as representing a section of your site. Islandora uses this to drive not only display, but also different operations behind the scenes like derivative generation, index reactions given certain conditions, and also object page displays, which we'll be covering a little later. Also, collection displays or other types of content displays based on things like display hints, such as a viewer display or a field formatter responding in a particular way in an entity view attachment or something like that. I'll go over that a little bit later. Next up, we'll be talking about customizing a page layout. So also on this menu is the general purpose discussion around customizing a page's layout. There's no single way to do this, but the presentation and demonstration today will focus around using the context module, its block layout reactions based system on given conditions, and leveraging existing modules and techniques. One of those technologies we'll be exploring today is the layout builder, which brings me to my next point. Layout builder itself is huge. It's worthy of its own webinar, really, but it's the kind of thing that some might spend their whole career building a knowledge base around just because it is so extensive. Layout builder allows you to build layouts in the user interface using the layout UI module with a drag and drop experience, allowing one to specify rows and columns, placing blocks or overriding block configs for a given layout, and work with fields on a piece of content as if they were blocks. Given the community around Layout Builder and how long it's been around, it's also very extensible. We're going to be taking a look at how it can be extended, and the selection of modules that are doing just that. And finally, at the end of this presentation, we're going to be talking a bit more about viewers and field formatters, which is essentially what a viewer is. Well, not one particular module or technique to cover here. We'll be going over a general purpose overview of existing viewers in Islandora, how they play into field formatters, and talk a little bit about custom field formatters for the purposes of extension. So without any further ado, let's move on to the first topic of the day. So that brings us to the color module. The color module, I don't want to spend too much time going over this really, but it's pretty critically important, I think, when it comes to branding. The color module, in my opinion, is the single easiest way to integrate unique branding into a site, especially if that site in question represents an organization that has a well-defined standard of branding. This module has been a friend to Drupal developers for many years now, and has seen a multitude of iterations and improvements over time. With an easy-to-use interface exposed in the administrative side of a theme, it's relatively easy to integrate and widely supported, and that's mostly because this is a core module now in Drupal. It allows color customizations of just about anything you want to target on the front end. Now, this does come with a bit of overhead since it requires some development knowledge to get integration done properly, but nowadays, more and more themes support the color module right out of the box. One example will be the Discovery Garden theme presentation layer I'll be showing during the demo phase of this presentation. But a ton of other community themes also support this core module and its implementation. So here's a quick screenshot of what I took of the UI in the Discovery Garden front end theme. It's what it might look like if you have it set up, depending on your schema in your own theme. So we'll talk more about schemas a little later in the color module. A multitude of color sets can be defined and swapped out using the select box we have here and choose different color schemes from the dropdown. Or the existing color scheme can be modified by using the color selector here on the right. The two adjacent colors, like the primary or secondary colors seen here, these settings have the lock icon between them selected. So when changing one, it'll change the color of the other while simultaneously keeping the color aspect in check. And just a quick note, this won't work if just updating the text value or the hex value in the text boxes that represent the color, but instead relies on the modification of the color selector we see on the top right here to keep the two color settings the same. Some basic permissions can help lock down access to something like this on your site to keep configuration, as I said, locked down but to specific users or permitted user roles, or delegate said permissions to specific roles. Now, given the integration of the color module into core and its popularity, it only makes sense that the Drupal community as a whole has leveraged it in a wide variety of themes. Many are available for free. A list of some compatible themes that have been supported, have the color module support baked in, that is available on Drupal.org and included at the end of this slide deck with a link to that page, which, by the way, we'll make accessible after the webinar. Some theme highlights before I move on that's worth mentioning that support the color module is the adaptive theme, which is advertised as a base theme designed for people who don't really code much, or for those who only want to write a little bit of CSS and still want a sleek, sophisticated theme for modern desktop and mobile site experiences. I've used it myself, and if you're going to use the adaptive theme, of course, it goes without saying, always make a sub theme. You always want to get the latest versions of these base themes. Of course, the Bootstrap theme is also supporting of the color module, and that a variety of Bootstrap-based themes leverage it. One such example is a Bootstrap Barrio theme. It's fairly popular, and its starter kit, supports the color module right out of the box. So some other themes that support include the Mayo theme, seen in the lower right of this slide, and premium themes like the premium responsive theme. Now, however, color module integration is not limited to the front end theme, but the administrative backend of the Drupal site might also use it as well by using an admin theme that supports it, which I'm going to show off here in a few minutes. But the admin theme in question is the Gin theme. Its implementation, as we're going to see, might be a little bit different in appearance, but still the color module is driving it in the back end. So we'll take a look at that a little bit later in the presentation. For now, first things first, let's have a quick overview of how to add support to a given theme. An institution or organization might not be willing to part with an existing Drupal front end for the sake of color module integration. So I think it's important now to quickly explore what it takes to add support to an existing subtheme. Again, I specifically say subtheme here just to drive home the point: never modify a base theme, whether it be Bootstrap or adaptive theme or anything else. Always create your own subthemes for things like this if it doesn't support color module out of the box. This is a generally accepted truth of reality by most Drupal front-end developers. I just want to drive that point home. Anyway, a link in this slide outlines some basic steps in integrating the color module into an existing theme. We see the quick walkthrough available on that slide. So one should really start their journey by kind of going through that document, but the steps involved are really updating a few files, adding a few new ones, and enabling a module in the backend. Now, one would need to create a few relevant files, as I mentioned, in the subtheme directory, like the color CSS file, the color.inc file, a file which includes a color scheme, which is that .inc file, some preview styling, preview HTML, and preview JavaScript, which will be necessary to update the target elements whose colors should be changed in the preview HTML. I'll switch over to my demo box in a few minutes and we'll take a look at what that's like. But for now, we'll just review what the theme.libraries.yaml file would look like after we update it. So this slide contains some screenshots of what the libraries YAML file would look like after having updated. to include the color.preview libraries and the global styling CSS and JavaScript definitions. As stated on the color module overview page on Drupal.org, the color module saves a modified copy of the theme's styles.css file in the files directory and includes it after the theme's original style.css by default. So this means that if you make any manual changes to your theme styles.css file, you have to save your color settings again, even if they haven't changed. So this causes the color module generated version of style.css in the files directory to be recreated using the new version of the original file. So this step is required because the module style sheets in the files directory need to be recreated to include the changes. So next, it's time to actually set up a color scheme. This might be more intuitive if you start off with a well thought out design and color scheme that goes with that design, but this boils down to copying the default color.inc from a base theme that supports it, or even the Drupal.org page where there's an example in that link I provided earlier, and update the key value pairs that exist within it. These screenshots should be fairly self-explanatory. However, the one sticking point I see folks getting caught up on is the color names and how they map to the color.css file. As long as the key values in the fields array and the scheme's colors array match, the configuration, technically the config form in the theme settings page should be functioning. Assuming the rest of the settings are updated to point to your local resources as necessary from the color.inc schema, it's the hex color codes that really matter here. They are the key that's being found and replaced in the color.css file when we regenerate those styles, that when it gets popped into your styles directory or your local directory where these CSS files are being built. Now, note the field names and CSS classes between the left and the right don't match, and that's okay, since one could use the same color to target multiple elements. It doesn't really matter, but the hex color codes must match, and they are case sensitive to the default color scheme we see linked here on the left. Now, I made this slide specifically to address this point, since years ago when I got started working with a color module, this simple fact, this little gotcha caught me up. If an attendee tries to take on the task of integrating the color module, I would suggest keeping this in mind. So essentially, where it's these values that really have to match up where it's found and replaced, not necessarily the class names or the index names that matter. So moving on, excuse me. Since we just finished an absolute basic crash course in the color module and its integration, I think it's time we put what we learned to work. So with a little bit of poking and prodding, we can use the color module with other front-end development techniques and technologies. So for example, the color module does not support Sass or less compilation out of the box. That could have recently changed, but last I checked, it wasn't supported out of the box. So I would like to explore that now as a possible option. To be fair, there's so many ways to address that issue, such as using CSS variables instead and a Drupal pre-processed page function, and jamming those CSS variables into the page header at that point, and referencing those variables in CSS or SCSS or less or whatever technology you choose to use. Or by leveraging existing modules that provide integration techniques to your existing Sass and less styles. We can manipulate and retrieve configured color schemes at different points of the page processing and loading operations via hooks in Drupal. This could lend itself to the next topic of conversation today, the context module. But before I get into that, let's take a look at what SCSS or less integration might look like. So with that said, I'm going to switch over now to my theme that in this case is a base theme. This is one I'll be showing off here in just a moment in the content home page there. But in terms of color module integration, you add a folder in your subtheme. You configure a color.inc file, which is essentially defining a base scheme and the fields that the color module is going to use to generate a color selector, and a few other things that are essentially used for the preview side of things, like the preview CSS, the preview HTML. Again, we'll take a look at what that looks like on the admin side of things, and the preview JavaScript. Preview JavaScript is worth pointing out here in that It is used exclusively to update what you're seeing on the preview side as you're changing what the color is on the back end. So you will have to do a little bit of finessing, that is, to add some JavaScript that pulls the color in question that's being changed and updates the appropriate fields. I also have a sample picture in here, as we see. This is just part of the display side of things. But because we're talking about integrating with CSS and SCSS or less, or whatever technology fits in your workflow, we're also going to have to update what appears in our libraries.yam file. So as we saw on the previous slide, it was pointing to a color.css file, which is loaded separately and loaded on top of what your styles are. But instead of doing that, I've decided to go ahead and simply use the base themes styles. So there is no color.css being added here. What I've done instead is decided to leverage a different module, which allows me to pass on these values from the front end directly into the Sass. I'm going to cover this a bit more detail a little bit later when we start talking about context. I don't want to spoil it. But for now, the integration technique revolves around using a third-party module, which provides us with a hook, which lets us change variables that might appear in our default Sass variables file. Now, because this is a Bootstrap-based theme for the sake of this demonstration, we're using what you would expect a Bootstrap-based theme to use, in this case, the default variables. So we're kind of building out all the colors on the site using a single color file, a single color definition. And by just changing one, we can have this cascading effect, which updates the template's colors. But there's nothing limiting us to changing just one of these colors. Now, again, I'm going to go into more detail about doing this a little bit later, but before I move on, I want to take a look at what this actually looks like on the appearance section of the site. I've gone ahead and configured this box. This is just a local development box that we use here at Discovery Garden. I'll jump over to the appearance settings. DG Collections, the name of the theme setting of the site. And beyond any Bootstrap-based theme settings we might see here, we now have the color scheme being form altered in by the color module. This is grabbing those configs that we have in the schema.inc, of which we can add a multitude of them. There's a DGI base that we've added, but you can also customize your own. That JavaScript I mentioned earlier that's updating the preview section, I could choose to lock these two primary and secondary colors, and as I update it, we can see the preview color updating as well. Now, that's not particularly pretty, so I'm not going to save these settings. For the time being, I think that covers how I've gone ahead and integrated Sass and CSS with the color module. Now, I'm going to explain, like I said, how that hook that changes these colors actually integrates with our build process, but that'll be a part of a following discussion. Now, I'm going to switch back to the demonstration here now and go back to, here we go. Sorry for the wait. And move on to the context module. Now, the context module is another one of those modules that has been around for some time and seen many iterations and improvements over the years. It's widely adopted and used by so many Drupal sites at this point. At the time of writing, there was something crazy like 126,000 sites reporting using this module on Drupal.org. So it's not just for Islandora. It's one of those modules that just what anyone in Drupal can leverage. And there's hundreds of different reasons why you might want to use it. And it also happens to be a backbone technology leveraged by Islandora itself. Context is responsible for driving a lot of what happens in the Islandora displays and scenes behind the scenes, like derivative generation, media and content indexing, view mode switching, say for use with views or EVAs, but more on that a little later. And then in the context of this conversation, no pun intended, we'll be using it today to review layout options for a given page. An important submodule here before I move on is context UI. It provides an administrative interface for managing and editing contexts. This is where we'll be manipulating the block placements and display of a page. Excuse me. Now, as a brief overview, context allows you to manage or customize or work with pre-configured contextual conditions and reactions for different portions of your site, like an Islandora object page view, for example. Since in modern Drupal, an object page is just a node, you can think of each configured context as representing a section of your site. So for each context, you can choose the conditions that trigger it to be active and choose different aspects of Drupal that should react to this active context. So again, think of conditions as a set of rules that are checked during page load to see what context is active. Any reactions that are associated with the active contexts are then fired up. We see this in action when we view an image, for example, given a specific term on a node considered to be, viewer helpers or hints. Switch the display mode on an object to be something else. So in this case, say a large image, switching the view mode to the OpenSeaDragon view mode using the context. So the user is presented within a different layout than just what's default for that object. As previously mentioned, we'll be focusing today on how the context module can help us define a page layout. We will get into more detail later on refining the inner content of that page, like how view modes, for example, can be manipulated with Layout Builder. But for now, the easiest way to control the page appearance is with existing blocks or block groups that are provided by Drupal core or contrib modules or something your organization may have whipped up yourselves in its own custom module. Now, a screenshot here illustrates a basic set of conditions to determine if the page in question is an Islandora object, or if it is a node with the term compound. So some other basic conditional checks that are done here, like the node bundle, ensuring that it's a repository item, and in this case, confirming the request path. The URL query parameters is part of a display solution that we see here that I put together to help drive a compound object display. Now, this is an interesting use case since this represents an area of potential growth, in my opinion, among the Islandora community and the users of an Islandora site. While there still may be some chatter about how best to display a compound object, ultimately it can be customized fairly easily. Out of the box, Islandora treats compound objects like collections, which does make sense considering it is just an object with the membership when it comes down to it. However, given that modern Islandora is so much more complementary to existing Drupal front-end techniques than legacy Islandora was, we can build upon this and make a custom display if we like. So instead of building an entire display solution into a solution pack, we can build one using views, view modes or EVAs, which are essentially the same thing, or any other tech we choose for a solution, really, and maintain that work as an exported site's configuration. So one could even create a black box solution out of completely different technology, say, for the sake of argument, React or Vue.js or something like that, and integrate it into a site via progressive decoupling techniques. And from there, the sky's the limit. But not to get too distracted, let's take a look at a custom condition. So in this case, a custom condition implemented by Islandora core and one used extensively throughout would be the node has term condition. The example class definition on the right is just a snippet of the context being built using the plugin API, showing injection, in this case, of the Islandora utils and the entity type manager. So modern Drupal and Islandora implementations of the context module use the built-in condition plugins supplied by Drupal through the plugin API. So any additional conditional plugins, it's funny to say, supplied by other modules can also be used with context. So creating your own conditions are fairly straightforward. Context-based reactions are also defined through the modern Drupal 8 plugin API. So the context module defines a plugin type named context reaction that you can extend when creating your own plugins. The plugin API in Drupal is pretty extensive, and it is as well deserving of its own discussion, but suffice it to say that implementing your own or extending existing plugins takes on an object-oriented approach to creating conditions and reactions. So I have included a link above the plugin API and at the end of this deck, of course, on Drupal.org, and of course, within the reference section that follows the last page of these slides. So next, we're going to take a quick look at how a reaction can be executed in response to a condition evaluating as true. So still utilizing the plugin API, one could create a context reaction in much the same way as a context condition. First, start by extending the context reaction plugin base and implement function overrides as necessary. We see the necessary function overrides in this slide. Note the ID and label and the comment twig declaration of the class here used for discovery of this condition, and also the namespace that appears above. The reason I'm going into the guts of context and reaction here, as keen-eyed viewers may have noticed already in the slides, it's to build upon what we discussed already in the color module section of this presentation. I've put together a simple module using a custom reaction, a publicly viewable repo on Discovery Garden's GitHub, by the way, that'll allow me to elaborate more on the color module's potential extended usage, its integration with the context module via custom reaction, and to provide a starting point for future work and a place to try out different context techniques in your own local development box. So all of this to address a common question I get when speaking with folks that work with themes and displays in Islandora. The question always comes up: how do you change the color or branding of a site based on the object being viewed? I hope to set you down the right path here. The solution I'm going to review with you now will show using the color module in context to change page colors. Part of the reason why I spent the time covering the color module and its integration to begin with. So based on a condition, all of this kind of comes into fruition. However, this demonstration is intentionally limited, since we would need a custom condition most likely to identify the entity being viewed as the one that should trigger the reaction. So in this simple example, we'll be using a node has term condition, much like the condition we saw earlier in the slides, to trigger this reaction. And from there, we will review how this affects the site. So this has some pretty far-reaching implications, excuse me. So given what we've discussed so far, creating condition to return true for a given configured entity, such as a node or collection, hint, hint, in Islandora terms, will be fairly straightforward, but a specific collection condition is not included in this demo module. I will give you a tip though, using what we've already discussed. We could index something like a hierarchy field in the Solr, such as member of, and use that as a condition to evaluate instead. Such a condition could evaluate to true on a collection page and members of said collection. So this allows one to do something specific on a given collection page or on member pages of that collection. Now, I've been cooking up something a bit more generalized in terms of a solution for this for some time, but it's not quite ready for prime time. So let's at least explore these concepts in the real world working scenario. So for now, I'm going to switch to my local development box to showcase this sample module and how it integrates with the color module and what conditions are used, and some extended usage utilizing another module I haven't really gone into yet or have yet to mention, the SCSS less compiler module. Now, while we were looking at the theme here, we noticed that within the libraries.yaml file, I'm not specifying CSS, I'm building SCSS, excuse me, since that's my preferred workflow for this demonstration. But what I'd like to do is now switch over to look at what our sample module looks like. It's webinar conditions. It's available here on Discovery Garden's GitHub. It should be open now. It's publicly viewable. Please feel free to fork and modify as you like. The purpose of this, however, is to supply a context reaction when something happens. In this case, we're working with the node has term condition. So I'm going to quickly jump into the context reaction, in this case, theme color alter reaction, which is what we plan on doing, and seeing how this is set up. It's pretty darn simple. It's more or less taking a configuration form that we have configured and saving a value. And this is essentially a configuration entity, really, since we've created it now through the plugin API. So once it's configured, it's saved, and the text field that we find, in this case, color, as part of the default configuration now being returned, it can be configured in the contextual user interface. So I'm going to jump over now to what the contextual interface looks like and how I've gone ahead and implemented that. And then I'll take a look at the .module file. So I'll get to the context page by going through the structure context section. And you've probably all been here before. A lot of things are happening here. There are a few new ones that you probably haven't seen yet, such as the compound objects display, which I said was just built through the user interface and is being maintained through a set of configuration exports, essentially, with, to be fair, a little bit of work happening behind the scenes in a module. But in the repository content items, this is basically a condition I've got set up now that basically everything that is not a collection will hit this condition and be used for, essentially for display. I'm going to take a quick peek at how this is configured here and what conditions go into it. So it's checking, like we saw on the slide, the repository item, ensuring that it has a term. Now we're negating the condition to make sure that everything that doesn't have these terms gets hit. And this request path is just here for simplicity's sake. The embargoes module likes to use a front end theme instead of the admin theme. So I've configured this so that it will use the administrator theme, and this condition won't get hit when you're working with embargoes in Islandora. As a reaction, all of those, all the node bundles, excuse me, that have the collection or compound object get a switch of blocks from what is configured on the structure block configuration section of the site. So there's a handful of things in here, but what really matters is the repository item metadata and the repository top item viewer. These are just views and EVAs that are used to kind of point the display in the right direction. I specifically point out repository item metadata as this is what we're going to be looking at a little bit later when we talk about Layout Builder. But for now, the theme color alter reaction is the one that's included in this module, and it is extremely simple. It's only meant to convey a point. In this case, I've set up a new hex color to use when these conditions are met. So things like collection and compound objects won't get this treatment. But essentially what I'm doing is changing a base color to a particular hex value. So I'm going to go back to the home page and take a look at the .module file that's provided at the webinar CD endpoint on Discovery Garden's GitHub. Excuse me. So I have this actually up in my development here, but I'll just use this web page for now. So essentially what we're doing is, since we're using a third-party library and module to build our SAS compilations, our SAS variables, because we're using a bootstrap SAS in this case for this particular theme, we want to be able to alter what goes into that build process, and this module allows us to do that. So we're taking the SAS compiler alter storage that gets passed in to this alter hook, and instead we're defining what a SAS variable should be. In this case, the base color. If we take a quick look back at the theme and we take a look at the default variables, we see that the base color in this case is being extended in multiple places. Now, this is just one of the themes that we've got working on, but this has been modified so it can cascade and change the color throughout the entire site. This is an option that comes with Discovery Garden's default display front-end technologies. So anyway, so what's happening here is we're using the theme color alter reaction that I have defined within this module and essentially checking to see if it's true. So we're just getting the active reactions that are associated with it. In this case, it should be on any object page that is not a collection or not a compound. And as a result, we pull the configuration out of that configuration entity that we set up earlier through the plugin API. We grab it and we pull it in and we pass it into the compiler. So by the way, you do need to grab your active theme to set the storage because like I said, the Gin theme, backend theme can have its own integration as well. You can have a handful of different schemas. We could even go bonkers here and use a color get info for a theme and pull back all the color schemas. So instead of just changing one color, we could change them all depending on what we have defined in the themes color.inc file, the schema file here. So if we have a whole handful of schemes that are defined here, we could pull them all back and based on a condition, change the color. So here we go, sorry. Back within this condition, we would have to set up a custom one if we wanted to do, say, collection or collection membership modification. So that's why I took the easy route here, just to kind of elaborate on what a context reaction looks like. So I'll leave the condition up to you, but it's really not much more complicated than the node has term. It would be more or less a node has value in that case. We're checking to see if the node being viewed or the one with the indexed member of field, that is a hierarchy field, matches what that node's ID is. There's any number of ways to kind of crack that, but that sounds like the simplest approach to me. So going back to my home page, I'll perform a quick search. And as this search endpoint here doesn't match any of those configurations, we see something else entirely. There's nothing to change the color here. That context condition isn't getting hit. But if I were to jump into the audio object to sample William Tell here, all of a sudden we should, there we go, see that the colors are completely different. So we can build a front end that's more conducive to the experience we want our users to have, depending on what institution or part of the organization they represent. We can take this technique and kind of modify it to fit those requirements or the branding requirements on an object page or collection page, or go nuts and make our own condition, add our own entity reference and check to see if the object itself or the collection match the hierarchy member of, if we were to do that technique, and then change it for all members of. So instead of just the color, again, there's any number of ways we can go crazy on this. So this is, by the way, while I'm here, as the default metadata display I have configured up, this is just being driven via a specific view mode. And we did see it in the conditions or context pages there, structure, there we go, structure, context, there we go. Anyway, the view mode is getting switched out here on the bottom to change what this display is, so we can configure what fields go where. I'm going to go over that a little bit more detail a bit later, but for now, I'm going to switch back to the presentation and just continue on. Now, here we come to the meat and potatoes. It's time to talk about Layout Builder. We've been using what we've learned so far about context and how blocks, view modes can be modified based on a set of conditions. I'll be building off what we have already discussed to leverage Layout Builder inside an existing view mode, which is itself a kind of display mode. But first, let's take a quick step back. The two types of display modes are view modes and form modes. Both of these display mode types, that is view modes and form modes, are examples of configuration entities. And as such, layout of these modes is exposed as a configuration, allowing one to determine what is displayed on an entity's page. So like a node, for example. Pardon me, a good example of this might be a view mode to drive metadata display like we just looked at. So before we get into that though, a very quick overview is in order, I believe. So Layout Builder and the Layout API offers the visual design tool. I'm sorry, it doesn't appear to be changing my slides. Hold on, there we go. Sorry about that. I was talking about the visual design tool for designing layouts. It's really the primary use case of Layout Builder. Now, creating layouts for content allows the creation of layout templates that will be used to lay out all instances of a specific content type. Say in Drupal core, something like a blog post or a product page, or even an Islandora object page using the content type of repository item. So once enabled on an entity type, Layout Builder replaces the default manage display feature for determining what fields and what field formatters are shown with a more powerful layout tool that can also place blocks in addition to fields. So customizing layout templates provides the ability to override these layout templates on a case-by-case basis. So the ability to override the layout of a standardized collection or object page for a specific node. You can get as crafty as you like here behind the scenes. But within Layout Builder, it provides the ability to drag and drop site-wide blocks and content fields into regions within a given layout. Additionally, custom inline blocks can be created for one-off details specific to a given layout. Now, Drupal's Layout Builder allows content editors and site builders to create visual layouts for displaying content. Users can customize how content is arranged on a single page across types of content, that is content types, or even create custom landing pages with an easy to use drag and drop interface. Here we see an example of the 3-section layout, each one using a different number of columns. Now, by now you're probably asking yourself, what are the actual use cases here? Layout Builder and Layout API and Layout UI offers the visual design tools for use cases, including layouts for content and customizations to templated layouts. Things like building different layouts for different content types, such as say a teaser layout or a metadata layout in our case, really just a method to arrange content on a page and add a touch of styling to finish off the appearance. As a now core module, Layout Builder has benefited from years of real-world implementations. And as a result, the Drupal community has created many companion modules to extend and complement the out-of-the-box features. So I just want to take a moment here to cover some of the more popular ones, but there are a ton of them. I've added a link at the end of this slide deck so you can check them out yourself, but these are just 3. We'll start out off with the Layout Builder library. It provides a layout library allowing content editors to pick from a list of predefined layouts. So site builders can create and deploy predefined layouts for each entity type and bundle combination. So content editors can pick from existing layouts, and site admins can prevent content editors from creating their own bespoke layouts, but gives them the ability to customize layouts on a per content item basis. Using these extended modules, you can get as restrictive as you like as site administrators and pass on the proper permissions to content editors. So you could lock particular fields so they couldn't change one field, but can change others, for example. That brings me into Layout Builder Lock, which allows an administrator to lock sections of the default layout. So other users without the proper permissions can't perform certain actions when overriding the layout for an individual entity. This is pretty useful as part of an overall institutional setting. And finally, the last one of dozens, the Layout Builder Asset. This is pretty popular. This module allows site builders to add CSS code and the ability to change it when laying out blocks in Layout Builder. That is during the placement and configuration of the block in Layout Builder UI. This module is definitely not a replacement for theming, but it provides site administrators with a quick and easy way to access and specify once-off style code. So the CSS injection allows administrators to inject CSS into the page output based on a configurable set of rules that round Layout UI and Layout Builder Asset. It's useful for adding simple CSS tweaks without modifying a site's official theme. I'm going to quickly go over this. I know we're running low on time, but utilizing Layout Builder allows the creation of column-based layouts. However, to get to this point, we need to specify how Layout Builder UI is to be used and accessed. So we'll need to navigate to a view mode on an object and first create a view mode we intend to customize. For this demonstration, I'll be using the metadata view mode configured on my sample box, but any view or rendered view mode should work here, since in modern Islandora objects are first-class citizens. Thank God. Thanks to the community for all the hard work pushing this work into configs, by the way. Native to structure display, navigate over to the display mode section of your view mode, and we'll add a display mode there. I have screenshots that illustrate these different steps as I go. It will be, once finished, you can save your work and return to the manage display section of the structure content type repository item. Under the default tab, if you scroll to the very bottom and enable a new view mode we just created under the custom display settings, we'll be able to select the layout driven example and we'll be able to click save. Now, on the layout driven tab on the top of the page, you'd scroll to the bottom and that's where you choose to actually use the Layout Builder UI. We'll expand the option set we see here. If it's collapsed, and choose to use Layout Builder and click save. And after having done that, we now have access to the Layout Builder UI for this display mode on this repository item content type. So at this point, I'm going to switch back to my demo box and now show off the manipulation of an existing entity view mode. In this case, I'll be using existing repository item metadata view mode, one that's already integrated into the system. But instead of using default field layout, we'll start using Field Builder in its place to add fields in a customized layout. So, switching back, return to the home section. First, I'm going to show you what this looks like before we do anything. So out of the box is a default metadata display, repository item metadata, excuse me. Very simple. It doesn't offer the verbosity, excuse me, of a metadata display built with Layout Builder, but it does allow you to add fields and labels, much like this you see in the sample audio here. Notice the color is also changing because of the condition we just covered. Anyway, the goal of this is to change the metadata display. This could be applied to any component or any view mode of a view. You can even drive it through an EVA, an entity view attachment, that is in itself a view which switches to a different view mode. There's any number of ways to crack this now, but I'm going to start from the simplest top-down perspective. We'll navigate to the structure, content types, repository item, and manage display. We could do this on a form display as well, but I'm going to choose to manage the front end display. Jumping up here, we see that there should be repository item bottom metadata. If I click on this, we have a number of different view modes here available to use, but within the repository item metadata, this is where you can add, rearrange, and change different fields that appear within your metadata section of an object page. But I think at this point, it's time we scroll to the bottom, like I said, and choose to use Layout Builder. I've gone ahead and enabled Layout Builder and Layout Builder UI already, so I should be able to just turn this on and hit save. Now, try not to panic because all these fields are going to be hidden after the saves this, and we'll be moving over to a different section of the site. There we go. So there's nothing else here. All we can choose to do is to manage a layout. Before I get into the manage layout section, just to quickly point out, there's no reason why we can't create our own layouts. I did mention that there's a module out there that offered many different options in terms of layouts in addition to building your own. But you can also include a layouts.yaml file in your theme. Sorry, let me get rid of that. In this case, here it's DGI 2 column, DGI 1 column. We're not actually using this for anything. This is just added for the purpose of demonstration. So when I jump into the managed layout section of my site, all of a sudden, the magic that is Layout Builder pops up. So by default, it adds all of these fields, which is probably not fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this section, and I'll start building this from scratch. I'll choose to remove this little pop out here. By the way, this front end, this is not the front end. This is a back end theme. We're using Gin here, just because I really like Gin. It's really clean. It's really great. I'm going to choose to add another section here. And when I do that, we can see the DGI 1 column, DGI 2 column. These are just examples of creating your own different layout sections. But for the top layout, I'll choose 1 column. Now I'll give it choose to add. And I'll choose to add another section. Be crafty, we'll choose a 2 column section. And of course, because it's 2 columns, we can choose how we want this to be split with the column settings. Choose to add that section. And finally, let's go nuts and add a 3 column section just because we can, and call 3 column. There we go. So now that we've set up the basic layout of what we want to use in this metadata display, it's time to actually add something meaningful. So I'm going to choose to add a block, but in the terms of Layout Builder UI, shoot, we're really running out of time. Fields that appear within a content type are also treated as blocks here. So something like a description. There we go. It's represented under a content field. I can choose to click it, and there's different configurations I can choose here. I can just have a plain text formatter, but descriptions are often huge. So we'll want to expand and collapse it. So by default, we have the expand collapse formatter pop out here too. So I'm going to leave all these settings by default. It allows you to configure more or less text and all that fun stuff, and the trim length, where trims. But I'm going to choose to add the block here, and there should be some, there we go. Some sample text just popped in there, shows what it looks like. And from here, I can add any block that might appear within the site, which is not limited to fields. So we can also build separate views, which in themselves could be pointing to other view modes, which in themselves could have configured Layout Builder options. This is a bit like going down the rabbit hole. You can make this as complicated or as simple as you like. For now, I'm just grabbing a few fields from the content type. So I'll choose subject, field subject, go. Block, and I'll add one more. I feel like genre is in here as well. Topic genre. Oh, if I could only spell. There we go. Pop in genre here. So you notice you can override the title and choose to display it or not. But I'll just leave that as it's by default. It'll show the field label that's associated with it, in this case above. So I'm going to choose to add block. Yeah, I'm sure you get the idea by now. There's nothing stopping me from adding any other number of content fields here within the 3 section column. So now I'm just going to quickly save my layout. And by the time this is done, I should be able to refresh my page and see something entirely different. Excuse me. There we go. So instead of having that one basic view mode, which is great, and in most cases that works just fine. But if you want to get crafty, if you want to add different things, if you want to build out a layout and then pass that layout off to, say, a front-end developer to just add a sprinkle of styling, this is an easy way to do it. So you can build, in addition to what's already there, any number of different view modes and use something like context to switch the view modes. We're already doing that much, say, in the terms of viewers, say OpenSeaDragon. This is to the terms of display, but it's a little different, but it works essentially the same way, in that this reaction will change the view mode to OpenSeaDragon view mode. So that's what drives it. So as long as we're building view modes and said view modes are taking advantage of the layout builder and layout builder UI, we could essentially customize just about any portion of the site that we wanted to, while simultaneously controlling all the other blocks that should remain the same within the theme appearance section of the site. So I'm really running low on time here. I'm going to switch back to the content displays, and we're going to have just a very, very brief discussion, because we're almost out of time here, on field formatters. There we go. So probably the most well-known viewer is the OpenSeaDragon, or a field formatter by another name. It's a modern Drupal field formatter, really, to display an image or generic file using a IIIF image server and OpenSeaDragon. The Drupal module OpenSeaDragon, maintained by the Islandora Foundation, comes with a large laundry list of compatible settings that is found on the admin config media OpenSeaDragon endpoints of your site, and includes some basic OpenSeaDragon settings like colors and auto hide controls, but more advanced settings like the IIIF manifest endpoint, where a view can be selected to provide the JSON data. That on any object page, by the way, you can hit the /manifest endpoint if you want to see the manifest of an object page. So are we getting some info popping in? Okay, yeah, questions, please go into the chat. We'll have unfortunately a briefer Q&A session that I had planned. Beyond the OpenSeaDragon viewer, there's the PDF viewer, which is a contrib module supported by the Drupal 8 community as a whole and driven by the PDF.js library from Mozilla. So much like how context condition, evaluated early in this presentation, these field formatters are acting in response to a node has termed condition most often. Just like we just saw, the OpenSeaDragon was using a taxonomy term. As a result, the node display mode is altered to one previously configured on a content type basis, which includes an entity view attachment, or EVA. The views displayed on the node attached media renders it in a custom display mode. So you've probably put together by now, there's not much difference between an entity view display is a media view display. All of these are leveraging existing Drupal technologies, and Layout Builder allows you to customize the layouts of all of these things. Be forewarned, however, when it comes to customizing layouts for a media file, like the large image or something for a media view, you'll have to turn off auto presentation, or it'll try and populate with sample content and it'll return an error essentially. So you have to turn that setting off on the context page. Now that's pretty much a typical life cycle of what most might consider a viewer in Islandora. As a result, things like binary files, audio video files, documents, for example, follow the same kind of logic. They just display in a standard Drupal field or use a browser's default media player. Now that brings me to the end of our presentation. I didn't really get to go into field formatters quite as much as I'd like, but we have a few minutes here for questions. I'd like to open this up. See, I'm checking the chat now, see if there are any questions, and it looks like there aren't many. Oh, I'm hearing the sounds. Spencer, are you there?
Yeah. If anybody has questions, type them in the chat. We got a few minutes left. If not, maybe you left them speechless. Morgan?
Oh, if only. I'm going to mute for a moment and take a drink of water. My throat is about to die.
I don't blame you. Just as a note, I will make this webinar available on YouTube, and I'll send out a communication with the slides Morgan went over with all the links and tips and tricks included. So it'll be available to everyone. But it looks like there's no questions, Morgan.
Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone for attending today. It's been my pleasure. And I hope that one day we'll be able to spend a bit more time going over more specific technologies like Layout Builder in its own dedicated webinar. And I look forward to hearing feedback from you. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yeah, and if your Thanksgiving is tomorrow, happy Thanksgiving.
Indeed, thank you.
See you, everyone.